Wrong Turn 3, Left for Dead is a 2009 American horror slasher film, and the third installment in the long-running Wrong Turn film series. The film was directed by Declan O'Brien and stars Tom Frederick, Janet Montgomery, and Tamer Hassan in the lead roles. It is a direct continuation of the horror universe that was first introduced in the original Wrong Turn film released in 2003, and this third chapter pushes that world of savage wilderness horror even further into dark and brutal territory. The screenplay was written by Connor James Delaney, based on the original characters created by Alan B. McElroy, who first brought this terrifying world to life. The film was produced by Jeffrey Beach and Philip Roth, with cinematography handled by Lorenzo Senatore, editing by Raul Davalos, and the musical score composed by Claude Foisy. The production companies behind this film were Constantine Film and Summit Entertainment, and it was distributed worldwide by 20th Century Fox Home Entertainment. One of the most surprising behind-the-scenes facts about this film is that even though the entire story is set in the dense, dark forests of West Virginia in the United States, the actual physical filming of the movie took place in Sofia, Bulgaria. The Bulgarian landscape and forests were carefully dressed and filmed in a way that convincingly replicated the look and atmosphere of the Appalachian wilderness. This is a common practice in low-budget horror filmmaking, where international locations are used to dramatically reduce production costs without sacrificing the visual quality required by the story. The total production budget for Wrong Turn 3 was approximately $2 million, which is an extremely modest amount even by direct-to-video standards. Despite working within those financial limitations, the filmmakers attempted to carry forward the brutal survival horror energy and grotesque violence that made the first two films in the franchise so memorable and popular among horror audiences globally. Plot details. The story of Wrong Turn 3, Left for Dead is built around two completely separate groups of people whose paths eventually collide in the most horrifying and unexpected way imaginable, all within the unforgiving and deadly wilderness of West Virginia. The film opens by introducing the first group, a collection of young friends who have come to the West Virginia woods for what was supposed to be a simple and enjoyable outdoor adventure. Alex, along with her friends Trey, Sophie, and Brent, head into the woods for a rafting trip along the river. They set up camp and begin to relax, completely unaware of the horror that is already watching them from the trees. Without any extended warning, Three Finger, the mutant cannibal hillbilly who serves as the franchise's iconic villain, descends upon the group with savage and merciless violence. Alex's friends are slaughtered one by one, and she barely manages to escape with her life, fleeing deep into the woods, terrified and completely alone. Three Finger is not your average movie monster. What makes him genuinely terrifying across the entire Wrong Turn series is his combination of physical brutality and a predatory intelligence that goes far beyond simple instinct. He sets traps with precision, he reads the movements of his prey, and he treats the West Virginia wilderness as his personal hunting ground. Every outsider who enters those woods is, in his mind, simply an animal to be hunted down and killed. He does not feel fear, he does not negotiate, and he does not stop until his target is dead. The second storyline involves a prison transport operation that is taking place on the very same roads that cut through Three Fingers' territory. Prison guard Nate has been assigned along with fellow guards Walter and Preslow to transport a group of highly dangerous criminals to a distant correctional facility. The prisoners being transferred are a varied and volatile mix of dangerous individuals. Crawford is a car thief. Floyd is a neo-Nazi serial killer with a violent and unstable personality. Brandon is a young man who claims he was wrongly convicted of murder. Chavez is the powerful and calculating leader of a major crime organization, easily the most dangerous human character in the film. And then there is Willie, who appears to be just another prisoner but is actually an undercover law enforcement agent who has been embedded within the group specifically to gather intelligence on Chavez. Even before Three Finger makes his move, the internal tension inside that prison transport bus is already explosive. The guards are outnumbered by dangerous men, one of whom is secretly working against another, and Chavez's commanding presence makes every moment feel like it is one wrong word away from total chaos. Then the moment that reshapes the entire film arrives. Three Finger rams the transport bus with his truck, sending it crashing off the road and deep into the woods of West Virginia. With the bus destroyed and all structure collapsed, the prisoners break free of their restraints. Chavez immediately attempts to seize control of the situation, believing that his criminal authority will protect him from whatever is out there in those woods. He is dangerously wrong. Three Finger does not recognize human power structures. He does not care that Chavez runs a crime empire, that Floyd is a serial killer, or that Crawford has survived on the streets. To Three Finger, they are all simply prey, and he begins hunting them with the same cold efficiency he has always shown. As the group is forced to move through the forest on foot, trying to find a way out before Three Finger picks them off, Alex crosses their path. She has been surviving alone in those woods since the opening attack and brings with her a first-hand understanding of what Three Finger is capable of, knowledge that the rest of the group desperately needs. Her arrival creates a new dynamic within the already fragile alliance between the guards and the prisoners, and her survival instincts become central to whatever slim chance they have of making it out alive. The film then becomes a relentless and brutal fight for survival where danger comes from two directions simultaneously. Three Finger hunts the group from the outside, killing with increasingly creative and horrific methods. Meanwhile, Chavez continues to operate with his own agenda, caring nothing about the safety of the group as a whole and making decisions that put everyone at greater risk. The tension between human villainy and monstrous villainy runs through every scene of the second and third acts, and the film makes it clear that not everyone who starts the journey through those woods will survive to see the end of it. Cast: Tom Frederick plays Nate, the prison guard who serves as the film's main protagonist. He is the moral center of the story, a man trying to do the right thing while being surrounded by criminals on one side and a cannibal killer on the other. Janet Montgomery plays Alex, the young woman who survives the opening attack and eventually joins forces with the prison transport survivors. Her character carries the emotional weight of the film and brings a raw survival-driven energy to every scene she is in. Tamer Hassan plays Chavez, the crime organization leader and the film's primary human antagonist. Hassan brings a commanding and genuinely menacing quality to the role, making Chavez feel like a legitimate threat even in a film dominated by a supernatural killer. Boris Lavaliev plays Three Finger, the mutant cannibal villain and the returning monster of the franchise. It is worth noting that while Three Finger appears in all three films, a different actor has played the role in each installment. Charles Venn plays Walter, one of the prison guards traveling with Nate. Mike Straub plays Preslow, the third guard on the transport. Gil Colleran plays Floyd, the neo-Nazi serial killer among the prisoners. Jake Curran plays Crawford, the car thief. Tom McKay plays Brandon, the prisoner who insists he was wrongly convicted. Christian Contreras plays Willie, the undercover agent posing as an inmate. Jack Gordon plays Trey, one of Alex's friends from the camping group. Louise Cliff plays Sophie, another member of the camping group. Charlie Speed plays Brent. Emma Clifford plays Deputy Ally Lane. Todd Jensen plays the U.S. Marshal. Bill Moody plays Sheriff Carver, and Mac McDonald plays the Warden. Release date and distribution. Wrong Turn 3, Left for Dead was released on DVD and Blu-ray on October 20, 2009. Unlike the first film in the series which received a full theatrical release, this third installment was produced and released as a direct-to-video title, meaning it went straight to home media without a traditional cinema run. This was a deliberate business decision by the studio, as the direct-to-video horror market was extremely active and profitable during this period, and releasing on DVD and Blu-ray simultaneously allowed the film to reach its target audience quickly and efficiently. In its first week of release alone, The film grossed over $1,800,000 in home sales, which was a strong opening for a direct-to-video horror title at that time. Over its total run, the film went on to earn over $5.9 million in home media sales globally, proving that despite its modest budget and mixed critical reception, it still had a significant audience within the horror fanbase. The film has a total runtime of 92 minutes and carries an R rating, which it earns through its graphic violence, brutal kill sequences, and intense horror content throughout. The film is in the English language and is classified as a production of both Germany and the United States, reflecting the international nature of its production companies. Trailer and promotional information. The official trailer for Wrong Turn 3, Left 4 Dead was released ahead of its October 2009 DVD launch and was designed to highlight the film's central selling points: the return of Three Finger, the prison transport premise, the West Virginia wilderness setting, and the promise of graphic and intense horror violence. The trailer leaned heavily into the franchise's established identity, making it clear to fans of the first two films that this chapter would be delivering more of the brutal, no-mercy survival horror that the series had become known for. The promotional campaign focused almost entirely on the home video market, with advertising placed across horror-specific media outlets and video rental platforms that were still prominent during that era. Additional details. Wrong Turn 3, Left 4 Dead sits as the third chapter in a franchise that would continue to grow beyond this film. The series eventually expanded to include Wrong Turn 4, Bloody Beginnings in 2011, Wrong Turn 5, Bloodlines, and Wrong Turn 6, Last Resort in 2014. The franchise was later rebooted with a completely reimagined Wrong Turn film in 2021, which took the series in a very different creative direction while still paying homage to the original concept. The critical reception for this third film was largely negative, with most reviewers feeling that it did not live up to the standards set by the first two installments. However, within the dedicated horror fan community, it still holds a place as a watchable entry in the franchise for those who enjoy survival horror with a mix of both human and monster-based threats running simultaneously through the narrative. Wrong Turn 3, Left 4 Dead, the complete story. The beginning, a trip that turns into a nightmare. The story of Wrong Turn 3, Left 4 Dead begins on what appears to be a perfectly normal and enjoyable day. A group of 4 young friends have decided to spend their time outdoors, away from the noise and routine of everyday life. Alex, Trey, Sophie, and Brent have come to the rivers and forests of West Virginia for a rafting trip. The idea is simple: get out into nature, enjoy the water, breathe fresh air, and have the kind of adventure that young people crave. Nobody in the group has any reason to believe that anything could go wrong. The area feels remote but not dangerous, wild but not threatening. They are excited, relaxed, and completely unprepared for what is about to happen to them. The group sets up camp near the river after their rafting activities. The mood is light and the atmosphere is comfortable. Trey and Sophie wander away from the campsite for some private time together, moving deeper into the tree line where they feel hidden and alone. It is at this precise moment that the forest reveals its true danger. Three Finger, the mutant cannibal hillbilly who has been living and hunting in these woods for years, has already been watching the group. He moves through the trees with a terrifying familiarity, completely at home in the darkness of the forest in a way that no outsider ever could be. He closes in on Trey and Sophie with horrifying speed and brutality. Neither of them has any real chance to defend themselves or even fully comprehend what is happening before Three Finger kills them both in a savage and grotesque manner. Back at the campsite, Brent and Alex are unaware of what has just happened to their friends. When the sounds from the woods shift and something feels wrong, the situation escalates with terrifying speed. Three Finger makes his presence known at the campsite as well, and Brent becomes his next victim, killed with the kind of brutal efficiency that has made Three Finger one of the most feared villains in the entire Wrong Turn franchise. Alex witnesses enough of this horror to understand that whatever is in those woods is not something she can fight or reason with. Her only option is to run, and she does. She tears through the dark forest with nothing but pure survival instinct driving her forward, leaving behind the bodies of her 3 friends and plunging deeper into a wilderness that she does not know and that already belongs to something far more dangerous than her. Alex runs until she cannot run anymore. She is now completely alone, deep inside the West Virginia forest, with no phone signal, no clear direction, and no idea how far she is from any road or town. She has seen Three Finger kill, and she knows that he is still out there somewhere in the trees. Every shadow and every sound becomes a potential threat. She moves carefully, trying to stay quiet and stay alive, desperately searching for any sign of civilization or escape, while the forest closes in around her. The prison transport, a different kind of danger. On a different road cutting through the same region of West Virginia, a prison transport operation is underway. Prison Guard Nate has been assigned to lead the transfer of a group of dangerous criminals from the Grafton Penitentiary to a more distant correctional facility. Accompanying him on this assignment are 2 fellow guards, Walter and Preslow. The 3 of them are responsible for keeping control of 5 prisoners who are being transported together in a custody bus. The prisoner lineup is a collection of genuinely dangerous and volatile individuals. Crawford is a car thief, the least violent member of the group but still a criminal with street instincts. Floyd is a neo-Nazi serial killer, a man driven by hatred and ideology, deeply unstable and capable of extreme violence at any moment. Brandon is a young man who has been convicted of murder, but who maintains loudly and consistently that he is innocent, that he was wrongly convicted and does not belong among the others. Chavez is by far the most formidable of the 5, the powerful and calculating leader of a major organized crime network, a man who has built his entire life around control, intimidation, and ruthlessness. He carries himself with the quiet authority of someone who has never truly lost a confrontation and who does not intend to start losing now. And then there is Willie. To everyone on that bus, Willie appears to be just another prisoner, someone doing his time and keeping his head down. But Willie is not a criminal at all. He is an undercover law enforcement agent who has been embedded within the prison system specifically to get close to Chavez and extract information about his crime organization. Willie's entire safety depends on maintaining his cover, which means he cannot reveal himself even when things begin to go wrong. He must continue playing the role of a prisoner even as the situation around him deteriorates beyond anything anyone on that bus could have anticipated. The transport is moving along the backroads of West Virginia, following a route that cuts through the heavily forested areas of the region. Nate and his fellow guards are doing their jobs, keeping watch over the prisoners, maintaining order inside the bus. The atmosphere is tense but controlled. Chavez watches everything with his calm, calculating eyes. Floyd radiates hostility. Brandon sulks and protests his innocence. Crawford stays quiet. Willie plays his role. And then everything changes in a single, catastrophic instant. The crash, where 2 worlds collide. Three Finger has been watching the road. He has seen the bus coming through his territory, and he does what he always does when outsiders enter his world. He sets a trap. With the kind of predatory patience and woodland intelligence that has kept him alive and hunting for years, Three Finger positions himself and his vehicle to intercept the prison transport. When the moment is right, he rams his heavy truck directly into the side of the custody bus with devastating force. The crash is violent and disorienting. The bus is driven off the road and crashes deep into the tree line, coming to rest at an angle in the forest. The guards are shaken and disoriented. Some of the prisoners are injured. In the chaos and confusion of the crash, the dynamic inside the bus shifts immediately and dramatically. The prisoners, sensing an opportunity in the disorder, begin to press against the weakened control structure that the guards had maintained during the transport. Chavez moves quickly to assert dominance over the situation. With the guards outnumbered and the normal systems of control disrupted by the crash, the prisoners gain the upper hand. Chavez takes charge of the group in the aftermath of the crash, and it becomes immediately clear that his priorities have nothing to do with anyone's collective safety. He wants to use this situation to his own advantage, and he is willing to let anyone who gets in his way suffer the consequences. The guards, particularly Nate, find themselves in an impossible position. They are still technically responsible for these prisoners, but they no longer have the physical control or the backup systems to enforce that responsibility. They are in the middle of a forest with no communications, no backup on the way, and a group of dangerous men who no longer feel the need to obey them. But none of them, not the guards, not the prisoners, not even Chavez with all his criminal intelligence, yet fully understands what is waiting for them in those trees. Three Finger is not just a force of random violence. He planned this crash. He wanted them in the forest. Because the forest is where he is the most powerful, and where everyone else is at their most vulnerable. Survival in the forest, hunters and the hunted. With the bus destroyed and no way to call for help, the combined group of guards and prisoners has no choice but to move through the forest on foot, trying to find a road, a town, or any form of civilization before Three Finger finds them. Nate understands that whatever differences exist between guards and prisoners need to be set aside temporarily if anyone is going to survive, but Chavez has no interest in cooperation unless it directly serves his own purposes. The internal tension within the group remains explosive even as the external threat from Three Finger grows more immediate and more terrifying with every passing hour. Three Finger begins picking off members of the group. His kills are not random or rushed. He uses the forest the way a master hunter uses any familiar terrain, with patience, with strategy, and with a deep understanding of how his prey moves and thinks. He sets traps along the paths he anticipates the group will take. He uses the darkness and the density of the trees to hide himself until he is ready to strike. His attacks are sudden, brutal, and horribly creative. Each member of the group who falls to Three Finger does so in a way that sends a clear message to the survivors. This is his forest, these are his rules, and none of them are equipped to fight him here. Floyd, the neo-Nazi serial killer, proves to be a source of additional danger within the group. His violent ideology and unstable personality make him unpredictable and dangerous even to the people around him. He does not share Nate's desire for cooperation, and his hostility creates internal conflicts that cost the group time and energy they cannot afford to waste. Brandon, the young man who claims to be innocent, becomes one of the more sympathetic figures in the story as it progresses, as his genuine fear and his lack of the hardened criminal mentality that the others carry makes him stand out as someone who genuinely does not belong in this situation. Willie, still maintaining his undercover identity, faces an extraordinary challenge. His mission was to gather information on Chavez, but that mission has now been completely overtaken by the simple and overwhelming need to stay alive. He must continue balancing his cover story against the reality of a situation that grows more desperate by the hour, knowing that if Chavez discovers who he really is, the threat from Three Finger will become the least of his problems. Alex joins the group. Knowledge meets desperation. At some point during the group's desperate movement through the forest, they cross paths with Alex. She has been surviving alone in the woods since the opening attack that killed her friends, and the experience has sharpened her instincts significantly. She knows what Three Finger looks like, she knows what he is capable of, and she has a first-hand understanding of how he hunts that the rest of the group completely lacks. Her arrival changes the dynamic of the group in an important way. She brings with her genuine, hard-won knowledge about the enemy they are facing, knowledge that could mean the difference between survival and death for some of the remaining members. Alex and Nate quickly establish a connection built on the shared understanding that they are both fundamentally decent people caught in a situation that is completely outside their control. Nate has been trying to keep order and protect lives since the moment the bus crashed, and Alex has been doing everything in her power to stay alive since the moment Three Finger attacked her camping group. They recognize in each other a commitment to survival and a moral seriousness that sets them apart from the criminal elements within the larger group. But even with Alex's knowledge and Nate's determination, the situation continues to deteriorate. Three Finger does not give them time to breathe or plan properly. Every time the group thinks they may have found a temporary moment of safety, he is already moving to close off their escape. The forest seems to work with him, as if the trees and the darkness themselves are conspiring to keep the survivors trapped within his territory. Chavez, the human monster. Throughout all of this terror, Chavez remains one of the most genuinely dangerous elements in the story. He never loses his composure in the way that the other prisoners do, and that composure makes him more threatening rather than less. He is constantly assessing the situation in terms of what benefits him personally. When members of the group die to Three Finger, Chavez calculates how those deaths change the power balance among the survivors. When opportunities arise to assert control or to eliminate threats to his authority, even threats from within the survivor group itself, he takes them without hesitation or remorse. Chavez at several points in the story actively undermines the group's chances of survival in order to maintain his dominant position. He makes decisions that prioritize his own escape and his own safety over the well-being of the group as a whole. His relationship with the other prisoners is one of authority rather than solidarity. They follow him because they fear him, not because they trust him. And as the body count from Three Fingers' attacks rises, that authority becomes harder and harder for Chavez to maintain, because the kind of power he understands, criminal power, organizational power, the power of reputation and threat, means absolutely nothing in the face of a cannibal killer who has spent his entire life mastering this forest. The confrontation between Chavez's human evil and Three Fingers' monstrous evil is one of the central tensions of the film's second half. Both are predators. Both are dangerous. Both are willing to do whatever it takes to eliminate threats to their dominance. But only one of them is truly at home in this environment, and that advantage proves to be decisive. The final stretch, deaths, desperation, and the last stand. As the story moves toward its climax, the group has been reduced significantly by a combination of Three Fingers' attacks and the internal violence generated by the human conflicts within the survivor group. Each death strips away another layer of the already fragile sense of safety that the survivors are trying to maintain. The forest feels smaller and more claustrophobic as the group shrinks, as if Three Fingers' territory is physically contracting around the people who remain. Nate and Alex emerge as the emotional and strategic core of whatever remains of the survivor group. They push each other forward when exhaustion and despair threaten to take over. Nate's sense of duty and Alex's survival experience combine into something that gives them a genuine fighting chance even when the odds seem completely impossible. The two of them face decisions in the final stretch of the story that test not just their physical endurance, but their moral limits. How far are they willing to go, what are they willing to do, and how much are they willing to sacrifice in order to make it out of those woods alive? Three Finger continues his hunt with relentless precision. The traps he sets in the final stages of the film are his most elaborate, and his most deadly, as if he is aware that the remaining survivors are more experienced and more alert than the ones he eliminated earlier, and he has adjusted his strategy accordingly. His presence in the final act is overwhelming, and the tension of every scene in which he appears is almost unbearable. The confrontations in the final sequences of the film are brutal, exhausting, and unforgiving. Characters who seemed like they might survive to the end are killed suddenly and without ceremony, reinforcing the film's core message that in Three Fingers Forest, there are no guaranteed survivors and no safe assumptions. Every moment of apparent safety is temporary, and the horror never truly lets go until the very last frame. The ending. The film concludes with only a very small number of survivors making it out of the West Virginia forest. Nate and Alex, through a combination of determination, luck, and the hard lessons learned from everything they have witnessed and endured, manage to reach the edge of Three Fingers territory and find their way back towards civilization. The road back to safety is not triumphant, it is exhausted, traumatized, and marked by grief for everyone they could not save. Three Finger, in the tradition of the Wrong Turn franchise, does not simply disappear when the survivors escape. He remains in his forest, alive and continuing to exist in the darkness of those West Virginia woods. The film ends with the strong implication that the cycle of violence is not over, that Three Finger will continue to hunt, that the woods will continue to be dangerous, and that anyone who makes the wrong turn into his territory will face the same merciless horror that every character in this story was forced to endure. The final image of the film leaves the audience with a sense of unease rather than relief. The survivors have escaped, but the threat has not been eliminated. The forest is still out there. Three Finger is still out there. And the next group of unsuspecting outsiders who wander into his world will have no idea what is waiting for them in the trees. The cultural and historical world behind Wrong Turn 3, Left for Dead. The historical roots of wilderness horror in American culture. To truly understand Wrong Turn 3, Left for Dead on a deeper level, you have to go back much further than 2009. You have to go back to the very roots of American cultural anxiety about wilderness, isolation, and the fear of what lives beyond the boundaries of civilized society. The United States, as a nation, was built on the idea of taming wild land, of pushing civilization further and further into territories that were previously untouched and unknown. But that process of expansion always carried with it a deep and persistent fear. The fear that the wilderness was not simply empty space waiting to be settled, but that it contained something dangerous, something that resisted civilization, something that could swallow a person whole if they wandered too far from the safety of town and community. This fear is woven deeply into American folklore, American literature, and American popular culture going back centuries. The earliest European settlers in North America wrote extensively about the terror of the forest, about feeling watched by unseen eyes, about the sense that the wilderness was an active and hostile force rather than a passive landscape. These anxieties were shaped in part by genuine danger, wild animals, harsh weather, difficult terrain, but they were also shaped by something more psychological, a deep human discomfort with spaces that exist outside the control and structure of organized society. The Appalachian region of the United States, which includes West Virginia where the Wrong Turn films are set, has always occupied a particularly powerful and complicated place in American cultural imagination. The Appalachian Mountains run along the eastern spine of North America and contain some of the oldest and most dense forest land on the continent. These mountains were among the first regions of the American interior to be settled by European colonists, and they developed their own distinct culture, traditions, and social structures over centuries of relative isolation from the rest of the country. Appalachian communities developed unique dialects, unique musical traditions, unique spiritual practices, and a deep and complex relationship with the land they inhabited. But the mainstream American cultural narrative about Appalachia has not always been kind or accurate. Over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, a particular set of stereotypes developed around Appalachian people and American popular culture, stereotypes that portrayed them as primitive, uneducated, violent, and somehow outside the boundaries of normal American civilization. These stereotypes were driven by a combination of genuine economic hardship in the region, geographic isolation, cultural misunderstanding, and a long tradition of urban Americans projecting their anxieties about poverty and difference onto rural communities that they did not understand and had no real connection to. The figure of the dangerous, inbred, cannibal hillbilly that appears in Wrong Turn 3 and throughout the entire franchise is a direct descendant of this long cultural tradition of Appalachian stereotyping. Three Finger and his family represent the extreme end of a cultural archetype that has been present in American storytelling for well over a century: the idea that isolated rural communities, cut off from the civilizing influence of modern society, might produce individuals who have regressed entirely from humanity into something monstrous and predatory. The cultural moment that created Wrong Turn. The Wrong Turn franchise did not emerge from nowhere. It was a product of a very specific moment in American horror culture that was shaped by a particular set of historical and cultural forces coming together in the early 2000s. To understand why films like Wrong Turn 3 existed, and why they found such a large and enthusiastic audience, you need to understand what was happening in American culture and in the horror genre during that period. The early 2000s were a time of significant anxiety in American life. The attacks of September 2001 had fundamentally disrupted the American sense of safety and security, creating a cultural climate in which fear was an ever-present and socially acceptable emotional state. Horror films in such environments tend to thrive, because they provide audiences with a safe container for anxieties that are otherwise difficult to process and express. When people are afraid in their real lives, horror cinema gives them a space to experience and metabolize fear in a controlled, and ultimately harmless way. The horror genre in America experienced a significant commercial and creative surge in the years following 2001. And the Wrong Turn franchise was one of many horror properties that benefited from and contributed to that surge. At the same time, the early 2000s saw a powerful revival of a specific subgenre of American horror that critics and scholars have called survival horror or rural horror. This was the type of horror that placed ordinary people from urban or suburban backgrounds into remote rural environments where they encountered threats that the comforts and technologies of modern life provided no protection against. Films in this tradition drew heavily on the cultural anxieties around Appalachia and similar rural regions, using the wilderness as a space where civilization's rules simply did not apply and where the most fundamental human instincts for survival were all that stood between the protagonists and death. The original Wrong Turn from 2003 was part of a wave of films that included other major horror properties of the same era, all of which were tapping into this same cultural vein of rural isolation terror. The success of these films was not accidental. It reflected something genuine and deep in the American cultural psyche, a persistent and powerful anxiety about what lies beyond the edges of the world that most people inhabit, and what kind of person or creature that world might produce. The history of the Wrong Turn franchise and where the third film fits. The Wrong Turn franchise has a specific and interesting history that gives the third film its proper cultural context. The original Wrong Turn was released in 2003 and directed by Rob Schmidt. It starred Eliza Dushku and Desmond Harrington and told the story of a group of young people whose car breaks down on a remote West Virginia road, leading them into a deadly confrontation with a family of inbred cannibalistic mutants who have been living in the forest for generations. The film was made on a modest budget, but received a theatrical release and found a strong audience, particularly among horror fans who responded to its combination of genuine tension, brutal violence, and atmospheric wilderness setting. The original film drew heavily on a tradition of American horror that stretched back through decades of genre filmmaking. The influence of films like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 1974 was clearly visible in the DNA of Wrong Turn. The isolated rural setting, the family of monstrous killers, the group of young outsiders being hunted through unfamiliar terrain, the contrast between the ordered world the protagonists come from and the savage, rule-free world they have stumbled into. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre had itself drawn on real historical cases and on deep American cultural anxieties, and Wrong Turn continued that tradition by updating it for a new generation of horror audiences. Wrong Turn 2, Dead End followed in 2007 and was directed by Joe Lynch. This second installment took the franchise in a somewhat different direction, introducing a reality television show premise that added a layer of satirical commentary about media culture and the commodification of danger and suffering. The second film was generally better received by critics and hardcore horror fans than the first, and it raised the overall quality standard of the franchise considerably. It also expanded the mythology of the cannibal family, adding more characters and giving the world of the films a greater sense of depth and history. By the time Wrong Turn 3 arrived in 2009, the franchise was working within an established set of expectations and conventions that both supported and constrained it. Audiences who came to the third film already had a specific set of experiences and associations connected to the Wrong Turn name, and those associations shaped how they received and interpreted the new story. The decision to introduce the prison transport element was an attempt to bring a fresh structural dynamic to the familiar wilderness horror formula, creating a situation where the threat from Three Finger was complicated and intensified by the human conflicts within the survivor group. The cultural significance of the prison transport element. The choice to center a significant portion of Wrong Turn 3's story on a prison transport carrying dangerous criminals was not simply a narrative convenience. It carried genuine cultural weight and connected the film to a broader set of American anxieties about crime, punishment, the criminal justice system, and the nature of human evil. The United States has the largest prison population of any country in the world, both in absolute numbers and as a proportion of the total population. The American criminal justice system and the culture surrounding incarceration have been subjects of enormous social debate and public anxiety for decades. By placing a group of prisoners at the center of a survival horror story, Wrong Turn 3 was tapping into a cultural conversation about what kind of people end up in the American prison system, what those people are capable of, and what happens when the structures and institutions that normally contain them are suddenly removed. The character of Brandon, the prisoner who claims to have been wrongly convicted, is particularly significant from a cultural standpoint. By the time Wrong Turn 3 was made, the issue of wrongful convictions had become a major point of public discussion in the United States, driven in large part by the work of organizations using DNA evidence to exonerate people who had spent years or decades in prison for crimes they did not commit. Brandon's presence in the film acknowledges this social reality, and uses it to create a character whose victimhood operates on multiple levels simultaneously. He is a victim of the justice system, and he then becomes a victim of Three Finger, which gives his story a tragic resonance that goes beyond simple horror genre convention. The character of Willie, the undercover agent embedded within the prisoner group, connects to a long tradition in American crime fiction and real-world law enforcement of the deep cover operative, someone who must abandon their own identity and live inside a criminal world in order to gather the information needed to dismantle it. This is a figure that has fascinated American culture for decades, appearing in countless films, television series, and novels, because it raises profound questions about identity, loyalty, and the psychological cost of sustained deception. In the context of Wrong Turn 3, Willie's undercover status adds an additional layer of danger to his situation. He faces not just Three Finger but also the constant risk that Chavez will discover his true identity, which would make him a target from within the group as well as from without. The cultural history of the cannibal figure in horror. Three Finger, the central villain of Wrong Turn 3 and the most consistently present antagonist throughout the entire franchise, belongs to a very specific tradition in horror culture, the tradition of the cannibal killer. Cannibalism as a horror concept has roots that go back far beyond cinema, reaching deep into human mythology, folklore, and cultural memory across virtually every civilization on Earth. The act of consuming human flesh has been regarded as one of the most profound and absolute violations of human taboo in virtually every human society throughout recorded history. This is precisely why it has such powerful resonance as a horror concept. It represents the complete collapse of the boundary between the human and the animal, the civilized and the savage. A cannibal killer in a horror film is not simply a murderer. The cannibal represents the idea that the human form can contain something that has entirely abandoned humanity, something that looks human but operates according to a completely different and utterly terrifying set of rules. In the specific context of American horror, the cannibal figure became particularly powerful during the 1970s, a decade of enormous social and cultural upheaval in the United States. Films like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre used cannibalism as a way of processing anxieties about the breakdown of American social structures, the widening gap between urban and rural America, the disillusionment following Vietnam and Watergate, and a general sense that the civilized order that Americans had taken for granted was more fragile than anyone had previously admitted. The cannibal family in those films was not just a horror device, it was a cultural mirror, reflecting back to audiences their deepest fears about what American society might produce in its most forgotten and neglected corners. Three Finger and his family in the Wrong Turn series carry this cultural tradition forward into the 21st century. They represent a version of that same anxiety, updated for a generation that had grown up with the internet and globalization but still felt the persistent pull of fear about what existed in the spaces between the connected, monitored, and controlled world of modern life. The historical context of direct-to-video horror. The fact that Wrong Turn 3 was released directly to DVD and Blu-ray rather than in cinemas is itself historically and culturally significant, and understanding that context helps explain a great deal about what the film is and how it was made. The direct-to-video market for horror films has a long and genuinely fascinating history in American cinema. It developed primarily during the 1980s alongside the rise of the home video industry, when the sudden availability of VHS players in ordinary households created an enormous new market for filmed entertainment that bypassed the traditional theatrical distribution system entirely. Horror was one of the genres that thrived most powerfully in this new market, because horror audiences were enthusiastic, loyal, and willing to seek out content that did not have the mainstream visibility or the critical endorsement that theatrical releases carried. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the direct-to-video horror market produced thousands of films ranging from genuinely creative and innovative work to extremely cheap and cynical cash grabs. The genre developed its own aesthetics, its own conventions, and its own community of filmmakers and audiences who operated largely outside the mainstream film industry. By the time Wrong Turn 3 was being produced in 2008 and 2009, the physical format had shifted from VHS to DVD and Blu-ray, but the fundamental cultural logic of the direct-to-video horror market remained essentially the same: a dedicated fan base hungry for content, a cost-effective distribution model, and an opportunity for filmmakers to work with creative freedom that the pressure of theatrical release would never have permitted. Wrong Turn 3 was made specifically for and marketed specifically to this community of dedicated horror fans. Every decision made during its production, from the casting to the special effects to the level of graphic violence, was calibrated for an audience that knew the genre deeply, had specific expectations about what a wrong turn film should deliver, and was watching at home rather than in a cinema. This context shaped the film profoundly and explains many of its characteristics that might seem puzzling when viewed through the lens of mainstream theatrical film expectations. The cultural legacy of Wrong Turn 3. Wrong Turn 3, Left for Dead occupies an interesting and somewhat complicated place in the cultural legacy of the Wrong Turn franchise as a whole. It was not the most critically admired entry in the series, and it did not push the franchise forward in the way that the second film had done. But it was commercially successful within the parameters of the direct-to-video market, earning nearly $6 million in home media sales on a $2 million budget, which by any reasonable measure represents a successful business outcome. More broadly, Wrong Turn 3 is part of a cultural conversation about American wilderness horror that has continued to evolve long after the film's release. The franchise as a whole was eventually rebooted in 2021 with a completely reimagined version that took the story in a radically different direction, moving away from the inbred cannibal family mythology and toward a different kind of wilderness threat. That reboot was itself a reflection of changing cultural sensitivities around the Appalachian stereotypes that had always been embedded in the franchise's DNA, as filmmakers and studios became increasingly aware of the problematic dimensions of using rural poverty and geographic isolation as shorthand for monstrousness and savagery. The cultural conversation that Wrong Turn 3 is part of, about fear, wilderness, the edges of civilization, the nature of human evil, and the anxieties that American society projects onto its forgotten and marginalized spaces, is one that did not begin with this film and has not ended with it. These are questions that run through the deepest veins of American culture and that horror cinema has been engaging with, in various forms and with varying degrees of sophistication, for as long as the genre has existed. Wrong Turn 3 is one chapter in that ongoing conversation, a product of its specific historical and cultural moment, and a film that rewards understanding precisely because of the rich and complex tradition it emerges from and speaks to. Here is the detailed life history of the main actors of Wrong Turn 3, Left for Dead. Tom Frederick, Nate. Tom Frederick is a British actor who was born and raised in the United Kingdom. He grew up with a genuine passion for performance and storytelling from a very early age, and that passion eventually led him toward the world of professional acting. He pursued his craft through formal training, studying the technical and emotional dimensions of performance in a way that gave him a strong foundation for the varied roles he would go on to take throughout his career. Frederick began his professional acting journey through theater, which is a path that many serious British actors take before transitioning into film and television work. The stage gave him the discipline, the vocal control, and the emotional range that would later serve him well in front of the camera. He worked through the early stages of his career taking on smaller roles and building his presence within the British entertainment industry before gradually expanding into screen work. His screen career began to gather momentum as he took on roles in British television productions, developing a reputation as a reliable and capable performer who could carry dramatic material with conviction. He worked across different genres, demonstrating a flexibility that allowed him to move between serious drama and genre entertainment without losing the authenticity that defined his approach to performance. Wrong Turn 3, Left for Dead represented one of his more prominent film roles, placing him at the center of a horror film that had an established international fanbase. Playing Nate, the prison guard who serves as the moral anchor of the story, required Frederick to carry the emotional weight of the film while also delivering the physical intensity demanded by a survival horror narrative. His performance in the film introduced him to a much wider international audience, particularly within the horror genre community, where the Wrong Turn franchise had a loyal and passionate following. Following his appearance in Wrong Turn 3, Frederick continued building his career across both film and television. He appeared in various British and European productions, taking on roles that allowed him to explore different aspects of his range as a performer. He never restricted himself to a single genre, which reflects the kind of artistic seriousness that characterizes actors who are genuinely committed to the craft rather than simply to commercial visibility. Throughout his career, Tom Frederick has maintained a relatively low public profile compared to many actors of similar ability, preferring to let his work speak for itself rather than cultivating a large media presence. This approach is common among British actors who come from a theatre background, where the work itself has always been considered more important than the celebrity surrounding it. He has continued working steadily, taking on projects across different formats and continuing to grow as a performer with each new role he takes on. Janet Montgomery, Alex. Janet Montgomery is a British actress who was born on October 29, 1985, in Bournemouth, a coastal town in the south of England. She grew up in a relatively ordinary environment and discovered her love for performance and the arts during her school years, where she began to develop the instincts and the emotional expressiveness that would eventually define her as a professional actress. Her early years were marked by a growing commitment to acting as a serious pursuit rather than simply a casual interest, and she made the decision to pursue it professionally as she moved through her teenage years and into early adulthood. Montgomery trained formally as an actress, developing her skills through dedicated study and practical work that gave her a strong technical foundation. Her training instilled in her a discipline and a depth of understanding about the craft of acting that went beyond simple performance into genuine character building. She learned how to inhabit a role from the inside out, which is a quality that would become clearly visible in the work she went on to produce throughout her career. Her early professional career involved a combination of theater work and smaller screen appearances, as she built her reputation and her network within the British entertainment industry. Like many young British actors, she understood that the path to sustained success was built on consistent work and continuous growth rather than on waiting for a single breakthrough moment. She took roles that challenged her, worked with directors and writers who pushed her, and gradually established herself as a performer with genuine depth and versatility. Her appearance in Wrong Turn 3, Left for Dead in 2009 was a significant moment in her early film career. Playing Alex, the young woman who survives the opening massacre and then navigates the horror of the West Virginia forest with growing resourcefulness and determination, gave Montgomery the opportunity to carry a physically and emotionally demanding role in a film with international distribution. The performance required her to convey genuine terror, raw survival instinct, and emotional resilience across very challenging filming conditions, including extensive work in outdoor locations that demanded real physical endurance. The visibility that came from being part of the Wrong Turn franchise helped open doors for Montgomery in the international market, and she used those opportunities well. She began to attract attention from American producers and casting directors, which led to an expanding career that crossed the Atlantic and established her as a working actress in both the British and American entertainment industries. Her career took a significant step forward when she was cast in the American television series Human Target, where she appeared as a recurring character and gained substantial exposure to American television audiences. This was followed by a role in the AMC drama series Mad Men, one of the most critically acclaimed and culturally significant television productions of its era. Appearing in Mad Men placed Montgomery in the company of some of the most respected television talent working at that time, and it demonstrated clearly that she had the ability to hold her own in the most demanding and high-profile productions. She then went on to land one of her most prominent and sustained roles in the television series Salem, an American supernatural drama that aired from 2014 to 2017. In Salem, Montgomery played Mary Sibley, the central character of the series, and her performance in that role is widely considered to be among the finest work of her career. Mary Sibley is an extraordinarily complex character, powerful. Playing a lead role in a long-running series across 3 seasons is one of the most demanding things an actor can do. It requires sustaining the same level of commitment and authenticity over hundreds of production days and across an evolving narrative that constantly demands new emotional and dramatic responses. Montgomery's success in doing exactly that in Salem established her as a serious and capable lead actress rather than simply a supporting or genre player. Beyond her major roles, Montgomery has continued to work across a variety of television and film projects throughout her career, building a body of work that reflects her range and her commitment to the craft. She has always approached her work with a seriousness and a dedication. In terms of her personal life, Janet Montgomery has maintained a relatively private existence, keeping the details of her personal relationships and private experiences away from the public eye. She is known among those who have worked with her as a genuinely dedicated professional who brings full commitment to every project she is part of, and she has earned a reputation within the industry as an actress of real substance and capability. Tamer Hassan, Chavez. Tamer Hassan is a British actor of Egyptian and Greek descent who was born on August 29, 1968, in Bethnal Green, in the East End of London. His upbringing in the East End of London was rough and challenging in many ways. The East End of that era was a working-class environment with its own very particular culture, its own codes of conduct, and its own brand of street-level toughness that shaped everyone who grew up there. Hassan was not exempt from the difficulties of that environment, and his early life included encounters with the kind of trouble and hardship that were common to many young men from similar backgrounds during that period. Growing up, Hassan was not initially focused on acting as a career path. His early years were characterized more by the survival instincts and the street knowledge that came from his East End upbringing than by any particular artistic ambition. He was a physically imposing young man with a naturally commanding presence, qualities that would eventually serve him extraordinarily well as an actor, but that in his youth were simply part of who he was as a person navigating a difficult environment. Before his acting career began, Hassan worked in a variety of jobs and lived the kind of life that many working-class East End men lived during that period: practical, physical, and far removed from the glamour of the entertainment industry. He had no formal acting training in the traditional sense, no drama school background, and no theatrical foundation. What he had instead was a lifetime of real experience, genuine emotional depth drawn from real circumstances, and the kind of natural charisma and authority that cannot be taught in any classroom. His entry into the acting world came through a connection that led him to the British film industry at a time when a new wave of gritty, authentic British crime and drama films was beginning to emerge. This new wave of British filmmaking was specifically looking for performers who brought genuine authenticity to their roles, who could portray working-class British life with the kind of credibility that only comes from actually having lived it. Hassan fit that requirement perfectly, and when he was given the opportunity to perform, it became immediately clear that he had a natural talent for screen acting that went far beyond what anyone had initially anticipated. His breakthrough came with the 2004 British film The Football Factory, a raw and unflinching look at football hooligan culture in England. The film was directed by Nick Love and became a significant cultural moment in British cinema, capturing a very specific and very real dimension of British working-class life with brutal honesty. Hassan's performance in the film was immediately noticed, and it established him as a genuinely exciting new presence in British cinema, an actor who brought real weight and authenticity to every scene he was in. But it was his role in the 2006 British film Kidulthood, and more significantly in its 2008 sequel Adulthood, that truly cemented his status as one of the most compelling actors working in British genre cinema. These films, which explored youth culture, gang life, and the consequences of violence in contemporary London, were enormous cultural successes in the United Kingdom and gave Hassan some of his most memorable and impactful performances. The same year as Adulthood, Hassan also appeared in the massively successful British comedy film Inbetweeners adjacent comedy The Inbetweeners Movie, but more significantly, he had already appeared in the hugely popular British film Is Anybody There, and had begun building his presence in international productions. His work in Wrong Turn 3, Left for Dead in 2009 was part of this international expansion, as he brought his natural menace and commanding screen presence to the role of Chavez, the crime organization leader whose human villainy runs parallel to Three Fingers' monstrous threat throughout the film. Hassan's physical presence, his size, his deep voice, his ability to project authority and danger without ever appearing to try too hard, makes him a natural fit for roles that require genuine intimidation. But what separates him from simply being a physically imposing screen presence is the intelligence he brings to his characters. Even in genre films where the role might be written as a straightforward villain, Hassan finds layers and specificity that elevate the performance beyond what is on the page. His career has continued to grow and expand across both British and international productions. He has appeared in a wide range of film and television projects, consistently delivering performances that reflect the authenticity and the natural screen authority that have been the defining qualities of his work since his very first appearance on screen. He has worked with some of the most respected directors in British cinema, and has built a filmography that spans multiple genres and multiple decades. Hassan is known within the British entertainment industry as a genuinely warm and generous person despite the often tough and menacing characters he portrays on screen. His journey from the East End of London to a sustained career as a respected film and television actor is a story of natural talent meeting opportunity, and of a person who made the absolute most of every chance he was given. He has spoken openly in various interviews about the importance of his East End upbringing to his understanding of the characters he plays, and about the way in which lived experience, real, sometimes difficult, sometimes painful lived experience, is the most valuable resource any actor can bring to their work. Borislav Iliev, Three Finger. Borislav Iliev is a Bulgarian actor and stuntman who took on the role of Three Finger in Wrong Turn 3. Left for Dead. His casting in the role was directly connected to the fact that the film was shot in Sofia, Bulgaria, and the production made use of local acting and stunt talent to fill several key roles in the film. Iliev brought a powerful physical performance to the role of Three Finger, using his body, his movement, and his physicality to create a screen presence for the villain that was both terrifying and strangely compelling. Playing a character like Three Finger is an extraordinarily demanding physical task. Because the character wears heavy prosthetic makeup and does not speak in any conventional way, the entire performance must be delivered through physicality, through the way the character moves, the way he holds himself, the way he approaches his victims, and the energy he projects in every moment he is on screen. There is no dialogue to fall back on, no conventional emotional expression through facial features. Everything must be communicated through the body, and doing that effectively across the full length of a feature film requires significant physical stamina and performance intelligence. Iliev's background in stunt work gave him the physical tools necessary to handle the demands of the role, while his acting experience gave him the performance instincts needed to make Three Finger feel like a genuine character rather than simply a prop in a monster costume. The combination of those two skill sets made him an effective choice for a role that many actors would find extremely challenging. Throughout his career, Iliev has worked on a variety of Bulgarian and international productions, contributing both as an actor and as a stunt performer. The Bulgarian film and television industry, while smaller than the major Western entertainment markets, has a long and serious tradition of filmmaking, and performers like Iliev who work within that industry develop real skill and real professionalism across the full range of their craft. His appearance in Wrong Turn 3 gave him international exposure that he would not otherwise have had, connecting his work to a franchise with a global fanbase, and placing his performance in front of audiences across multiple continents. The role of Three Finger is one of the most physically demanding and visually distinctive villain roles in the Wrong Turn series, and Iliev handled the challenge with genuine commitment and effectiveness. The budget and making of Wrong Turn 3, Left for Dead, plus fun and funny moments on set. How the budget was decided, and why it was so small. Wrong Turn 3, Left for Dead was made on a production budget of approximately $2 million. To put that number into proper perspective, the average Hollywood horror film during that same period was being made on budgets ranging anywhere from $10 million to $50 million and beyond. $2 million is an extraordinarily tight amount of money to make a feature-length film with a cast of over a dozen speaking roles, extensive outdoor location work, multiple vehicle sequences including a full bus crash, and the kind of elaborate gore and practical special effects that the Wrong Turn franchise had built its entire identity around. The decision to make the film on such a limited budget was not accidental or careless. It was a very deliberate business strategy by the production companies involved, specifically Constantine Film and Summit Entertainment. By the time Wrong Turn 3 was being developed, the first two films in the series had already demonstrated a very clear and reliable commercial pattern. They were not films that needed theatrical releases to generate profit. Their audience was the direct-to-video market, the horror fans who bought DVDs, rented from video stores, and later streamed content at home. That audience did not require massive marketing campaigns or wide cinema releases. What they required was content that delivered on the basic promises of the franchise: horror, violence, survival tension, and the return of the iconic villain Three Finger. Constantine Film had extensive experience producing genre films in exactly this way, and they understood the economics of the direct-to-video horror market better than almost anyone else working in the industry at that time. They knew that if you kept the budget tight and the production efficient, a film like Wrong Turn 3 could generate a very healthy profit margin from home video sales alone without ever needing to compete in a theatrical market where it would have faced enormous competition from much more expensively produced films. The $2 million budget was calculated to cover all the essential elements of production: cast salaries, crew costs, location fees, equipment, post-production work including editing and visual effects, music composition, and the final delivery costs for the DVD and Blu-ray releases. Every single department on this production was operating with a fraction of what they would normally have access to on a standard Hollywood production, which meant that every head of department had to be extraordinarily creative and resourceful in finding ways to deliver professional results with very limited resources. Why Bulgaria was chosen and how it saved the production. One of the single most important financial decisions made during the planning of Wrong Turn 3 was the choice to film in Sofia, Bulgaria rather than in the United States. This decision alone is estimated to have saved the production a very significant portion of what the film would otherwise have cost had it been filmed in America, particularly in West Virginia where the story is set. Bulgaria had by the mid-2000s established itself as a genuinely attractive destination for international film productions looking to reduce costs without sacrificing production quality. The country offered a combination of advantages that very few other locations could match simultaneously. Labor costs for both cast and crew in Bulgaria were dramatically lower than equivalent costs in the United States or Western Europe. The Bulgarian film industry had a pool of skilled and experienced professionals, directors of photography, production designers, costume designers, makeup artists, stunt coordinators, and supporting cast members, who were capable of delivering work of real quality at a fraction of the cost their Western counterparts would demand. The Bulgarian landscape also worked very much in the production's favor. The forests around Sofia are dense, atmospheric, and genuinely wild-looking in a way that photographed beautifully as a substitute for the American Appalachian wilderness. With the right camera angles, the right lighting, and the right set dressing, the Bulgarian forest convinced audiences around the world that they were watching something filmed deep in the mountains of West Virginia. The production design team worked hard to add specifically American visual details to key scenes, road signs, vehicle markings, uniform insignia, that helped sell the illusion completely. The prison transport bus used in the film, the police vehicles, and all the other American-style props and set pieces were either sourced locally in Bulgaria and modified to look American, or brought in specifically for the production. The production design department on Wrong Turn 3, working with an extremely limited budget, did a remarkable job of creating an environment that felt genuinely American despite being assembled thousands of miles away from the United States. Local Bulgarian actors and stunt performers filled many of the supporting and background roles in the film, with Borislav Iliev, a Bulgarian actor and stuntman, taking on the central role of Three Finger himself. Using local talent in this way was both a financial decision and a practical one, as it reduced the cost of bringing additional cast members from the United States or the United Kingdom while also giving the production access to skilled performers who were already familiar with the local working conditions. The practical effects challenge: doing a lot with very little. One of the most significant creative and financial challenges facing the production of Wrong Turn 3 was the question of how to deliver the level of gore and practical horror effects that the franchise's audience expected, while working within a budget that gave the special effects department almost no room to maneuver. The Wrong Turn franchise had built its reputation on genuinely visceral and creative practical effects, kills that were inventive, graphic, and memorable. Audiences who came to these films had specific expectations about the quality and creativity of the violence, and disappointing those expectations would have been commercially damaging regardless of how good the rest of the film was. The special effects team on Wrong Turn 3 faced the challenge of meeting those expectations while spending a tiny fraction of what the effects work in a standard horror film of that era would have cost. The team responded to this challenge with a combination of practical ingenuity and creative compromise. They focused their most expensive and elaborate effects work on the kill sequences that would have the greatest impact on the audience, while finding cheaper solutions for the surrounding material. Prosthetic makeup, fake blood, and practical physical rigs were used wherever possible in preference to digital effects, partly because practical effects are often cheaper to execute effectively than digital ones at this budget level, and partly because the physical reality of practical effects tends to photograph more convincingly in a naturalistic outdoor setting. The three-finger prosthetic makeup and costume required significant work from the makeup department, as creating a convincingly grotesque mutant villain look is one of the more technically demanding aspects of this kind of horror filmmaking. The team worked within their budget constraints to create a look for Three-Finger that was consistent with his appearance in the previous films while also being achievable within the time and financial limitations of the production. Boris Lavaliev, who played the role, spent considerable time each shooting day in the makeup chair being transformed into the character, a process that required patience and commitment from both the actor and the makeup artists. The bus crash sequence was one of the most logistically complex and expensive individual elements of the entire production. Staging a convincing vehicle crash in a forest environment requires careful coordination between the stunt team, the camera department, and the safety personnel, and it demands a level of planning and preparation that costs time, which on a low-budget production translates directly into money. The stunt coordinator worked closely with the director Declan O'Brien to design the crash in a way that would photograph dramatically and convincingly while minimizing the actual physical risk to the performers and the cost of executing the sequence. Director Declan O'Brien and his approach on set. Declan O'Brien was the director brought in to helm Wrong Turn 3, and his approach to the production was shaped entirely by the realities of the budget and schedule he was working within. O'Brien was not a first-time director. He had experience working in genre entertainment and understood the specific demands of horror filmmaking at the lower end of the budget spectrum. He knew that on a production like this one, speed was essential and indecision was the enemy. On a $2 million budget, every day of shooting costs money that the production simply does not have in reserve. There is no financial cushion to absorb delays, reshoots, or extended creative deliberation on set. O'Brien adopted a working style that prioritized efficiency and decisiveness without sacrificing the creative standards that the film needed to meet. He prepared extensively before each shooting day, arriving on set with a very clear vision of what he needed to capture and how he intended to capture it, so that the time on set could be spent actually shooting rather than planning and discussing. His working relationship with the cast was one of the more interesting dynamics on set. He was directing a group that included experienced British actors, Bulgarian performers, and a supporting cast with varying levels of screen experience, and he had to find ways of communicating his creative vision effectively across those different backgrounds and experience levels. By all accounts, he was a collaborative and communicative director who made his performers feel heard and supported even within the very constrained circumstances of the production. Funny and light-hearted moments on set. Despite the dark and intense subject matter of the film, the atmosphere on the set of Wrong Turn 3 was apparently far from grim. Film sets, particularly horror film sets where cast and crew spend long hours together in often uncomfortable conditions, tend to develop their own particular culture of humor and camaraderie, and the Wrong Turn 3 set was no exception to this pattern. One of the most frequently discussed sources of humor on set involved the three-finger costume and makeup. Boris Lavaliev, who spent hours each day being transformed into the monstrous villain through the application of extensive prosthetics and makeup, apparently had a very warm and humorous personality that stood in almost complete comic contrast to the terrifying character he was being transformed into. Cast and crew members reportedly found it genuinely funny to watch this friendly and good-natured person slowly disappear under layers of grotesque prosthetics, only to emerge looking like one of the most frightening villains in modern horror cinema. The contrast between who Iliev was as a person and what he looked like as Three-Finger was apparently a consistent source of amusement throughout the production, and Iliev himself played into the joke on multiple occasions, doing things like waving cheerfully at crew members or speaking in a completely normal and friendly manner while in full Three-Finger costume and makeup, which created an almost surreal comedic effect. The outdoor filming conditions in the Bulgarian forests provided their own share of unplanned comic moments. Filming in dense, real woodland environments is inherently unpredictable, and the production encountered all the usual challenges that come with shooting in nature: unexpected weather changes, difficult terrain, insects, and the general chaos that results from trying to run a professional film production in an environment that was not designed to accommodate cameras, lights, and dozens of people with equipment. There were numerous occasions during the production where scenes had to be paused or reset because of something completely unexpected happening in the natural environment, and the cast and crew generally responded to these interruptions with laughter rather than frustration. Tamer Hassan, who plays the menacing crime boss Chavez in the film, is known in real life as a person with an enormous and infectious sense of humor. People who have worked with Hassan across multiple productions consistently describe him as one of the most entertaining people to have on a film set, someone who can keep the energy of a cast and crew positive through long and difficult shooting days with his natural comedic personality. On the set of Wrong Turn 3, he was apparently a constant source of jokes and improvised humor between takes, making it very difficult for cast members who were supposed to be frightened of his character to maintain that fear when the cameras were not rolling. The experience of watching someone deliver an intensely threatening and menacing performance as Chavez and then immediately become the most cheerful and funny person on set the moment the director called cut was reportedly a consistently amusing aspect of the production for everyone involved. Janet Montgomery, who played the film's central survivor character Alex, had to spend much of her filming time in a state of physical and emotional distress, running, screaming, reacting to horrific circumstances, and conveying the kind of exhausted terror that a real survival situation would produce. Sustaining that level of physical and emotional performance across a full shooting schedule is genuinely draining, and the cast and crew apparently developed a tradition of finding ways to make each other laugh between takes specifically to break the tension and give the performers a chance to reset emotionally before going back into intense scenes. Montgomery herself was apparently a good sport about the more physically demanding and occasionally undignified aspects of her role: the mud, the rain, the stumbling through forest undergrowth, and her ability to laugh at the situation she was in reportedly made her a very popular presence on set among cast and crew alike. The language barrier between the English-speaking lead cast and some of the Bulgarian crew and supporting cast members was another source of frequent amusement on set. Despite the best efforts of translators and the general international fluency that working in the film industry tends to develop, there were inevitably moments of miscommunication that resulted in situations nobody had intended and that everyone found funny in retrospect. These kinds of cross-cultural misunderstandings are a common feature of international co-productions, and the cast and crew of Wrong Turn 3 apparently handled them with good humor and genuine warmth rather than frustration. The props department, working under extreme budget pressure to create convincing horror movie weapons, traps, and gore effects with very limited resources, apparently developed a reputation among the cast for finding creative and sometimes hilariously improvised solutions to the problems they faced. There were reportedly several occasions where props that had been carefully prepared for a specific scene did not behave in the way they were supposed to when the cameras started rolling, leading to moments of unplanned chaos that required quick thinking from everyone involved. These kinds of on-set mishaps are a natural part of low-budget filmmaking, and the ability to laugh at them and find rapid solutions is one of the things that distinguishes experienced film crews from inexperienced ones. Overall, the set of Wrong Turn 3, Left for Dead appears to have been a genuinely enjoyable working environment despite the challenging conditions and the limited resources. The combination of an experienced director, a cast with good chemistry and a shared sense of humor, and a crew that was committed to making the best possible film within their constraints created an atmosphere that balanced professionalism with the kind of human warmth and levity that makes even the most difficult productions worth remembering fondly. The film that resulted from those weeks of shooting in the Bulgarian forest may have received mixed reviews from critics, but the people who made it clearly found the experience memorable and the company of their fellow cast and crew members genuinely enjoyable throughout the process. Here is the detailed cultural and historical breakdown of Wrong Turn 3, Left for Dead. Wrong Turn 3, Left for Dead, Cultural and Historical Details. The historical roots of backwoods horror in American culture. To truly understand Wrong Turn 3, Left for Dead on a cultural and historical level, you have to go back much further than the film itself. You have to go back to the very roots of American folklore, American geography, and the deep and complicated relationship that American culture has always had with its own wilderness. The story of Three Finger, and the cannibal hillbilly mythology that the entire Wrong Turn franchise is built upon does not exist in a vacuum. It is the product of decades, and in some cases centuries, of cultural storytelling, social anxiety, and historical reality that together created the specific brand of fear that these films tap into so effectively. America is a country that was built outward from the coasts and the major population centers into an interior that was vast, largely unmapped, and genuinely dangerous for much of its early history. The Appalachian Mountain region, which includes West Virginia where the Wrong Turn films are set, was one of the last areas of the eastern United States to be fully integrated into the broader American social and economic mainstream. For much of American history, the people who lived deep in the Appalachian forests were genuinely isolated from the rest of the country, cut off by geography, by poverty, and by the simple physical remoteness of the terrain they inhabited. This isolation created a culture within the Appalachian region that was genuinely distinct from mainstream American culture. The people of the deep Appalachian forests developed their own traditions, their own dialects, their own social structures, and their own ways of relating to the land around them. They were extraordinarily self-sufficient out of necessity, because the alternative to self-sufficiency in that environment was simply not surviving. They hunted, they farmed, they built their own structures, and they maintained communities that operated largely independently of the governmental and commercial systems that organized life in the cities and towns of the wider country. This genuine cultural distinctiveness became, over time, a source of fascination and fear for mainstream American culture. The people of the cities and suburbs looked at the deep Appalachian communities and saw something that felt foreign and threatening precisely because it was so different from their own experience of American life. Folklore and popular storytelling began to fill in the gaps of real knowledge about these communities with imagination, and the imagination that was applied to this task was frequently dark and frightening. Stories circulated about inbreeding, about violence, about communities that had cut themselves off from civilized values along with civilized society, and about the dangers that awaited outsiders who wandered too deep into that territory. These stories were not entirely invented from nothing. There were real historical cases of isolated communities in the Appalachian region that had developed genetic abnormalities as a result of generations of limited genetic diversity, and there were real incidents of violence against outsiders who stumbled into remote areas where the normal rules of law and social conduct had limited reach. But popular culture took these real but relatively rare phenomena and amplified them dramatically, transforming them into a mythology of rural horror that became one of the most persistent and powerful strands of American folk terror. The hillbilly horror tradition in American cinema. The cinematic tradition that Wrong Turn 3 belongs to has deep and well-established roots in American film history. The hillbilly horror genre, films centered on the threat posed by violent, degenerate, or cannibalistic rural characters to urban or suburban outsiders, has been a consistent presence in American cinema since at least the early 1970s, and its cultural significance goes far beyond simple entertainment. The film that is most often cited as the founding text of this particular horror tradition is Deliverance, the 1972 John Berman film based on James Dickey's novel of the same name. Deliverance told the story of four city men who traveled to rural Georgia for a canoe trip and encountered terrifying violence at the hands of local men. The film was a major cultural event when it was released, and it crystallized in the American popular imagination a set of fears about rural America and rural people that had been building for decades. The image of the threatening, violent, sexually predatory rural man became one of the defining horror archetypes of American cinema after Deliverance, and its influence on every subsequent film in the genre, including Wrong Turn and its sequels, is impossible to overstate. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, released in 1974, pushed this tradition into even darker and more extreme territory. Tobe Hooper's film presented a family of cannibalistic killers living in rural Texas, and the visceral horror it generated was directly connected to the same cultural anxieties about rural isolation, degeneration, and the threat of the American wilderness that had powered Deliverance 2 years earlier. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre became one of the most influential horror films ever made, and the cannibal family it introduced, grotesquely deformed, operating completely outside normal social and moral structures, viewing outsiders purely as prey, became a template that horror filmmakers would return to again and again in the decades that followed. The Hills Have Eyes, Wes Craven's 1977 film, continued this tradition with the story of a family stranded in the Nevada desert and menaced by a clan of savage, mutant killers. Craven's film was explicitly engaged with questions of civilization versus savagery, and the mutant cannibals of the film were presented as a kind of dark mirror of the normal American family at the center of the story, suggesting that the capacity for savage violence was not something that existed only in remote and isolated places but was present within every human being, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. Wrong Turn and its sequels, including Wrong Turn 3, Left for Dead, sit directly within this tradition and are conscious inheritors of everything that Deliverance, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and The Hills Have Eyes established. Three Finger and his family are recognizably descended from Leatherface and his family, from the mutants of Craven's Desert, and from the threatening rural figures of Berman's Georgia. What the Wrong Turn films added to this tradition was a heightened emphasis on the physical deformity of the killers, the result of generations of inbreeding, and a setting in the specific geographic and cultural landscape of West Virginia, which carries its own particular weight in the American cultural imagination. West Virginia as a cultural symbol. The choice of West Virginia as the setting for the Wrong Turn franchise is culturally significant in ways that go beyond simple geography. West Virginia is one of the poorest states in the United States, consistently ranking at or near the bottom of national measures of economic prosperity, educational attainment, and public health. It is a state with a complex and often painful history, a history shaped by the coal industry that dominated its economy for generations, by the exploitation of its natural resources and its working population by outside commercial interests, and by the gradual economic decline that followed the collapse of the coal industry in the late 20th century. West Virginia was also, for much of American history, genuinely isolated in ways that had real consequences for its population. The mountain terrain that makes the state visually dramatic also made it extraordinarily difficult to connect to the broader American transportation and communication networks that drove economic development in other parts of the country. Communities that were cut off from those networks developed in ways that were shaped by their isolation, and the poverty and limited opportunity that resulted from that isolation created social conditions that were genuinely difficult, and in some cases genuinely desperate. The cultural mythology around West Virginia that circulates in mainstream American popular culture is heavily influenced by this history of poverty, isolation, and exploitation. West Virginia has often been portrayed in popular media as a place of backwardness, danger, and otherness, a place where the rules of normal American life do not fully apply and where outsiders venture at their own risk. This portrayal is deeply unfair to the vast majority of West Virginians, who are ordinary people living ordinary lives, but it is culturally powerful and it provides the Wrong Turn franchise with a setting that carries enormous symbolic weight for its audience. When the Wrong Turn films place their victims in the forests of West Virginia, they are drawing on this entire cultural history, on everything that West Virginia represents in the American imagination in terms of isolation, poverty, danger, and the fear of the unknown interior. The forest of the Wrong Turn films is not just a physical location. It is a cultural symbol of everything that mainstream American society fears about the parts of itself that it has left behind, exploited, and chosen not to think about too carefully. The social commentary within the horror. Wrong Turn 3, Left for Dead, like many horror films that engage with the hillbilly horror tradition, contains within its genre framework a set of social observations and cultural tensions that are worth examining seriously. The film is not primarily interested in social commentary. It is a direct-to-video horror film made on a very limited budget with commercial rather than artistic ambitions at its core. But the material it works with inevitably carries cultural and social weight that is present whether the filmmakers intended it or not. The central premise of the film, a group of dangerous criminals being transported through a wilderness that contains an even more dangerous predator, creates an interesting framework for thinking about different kinds of human violence and the social structures that are supposed to contain and manage that violence. The prisoners in the film represent the kind of violence that society recognizes, categorizes, and attempts to control through the institutions of the justice system. They have been identified as threats, processed through the legal system, and are being physically moved from one containment facility to another. They exist within a social framework even in their criminality. Three Finger represents a completely different kind of violence, one that exists entirely outside social frameworks, that has never been recognized or processed by any institution, and that operates according to rules and values that have nothing in common with mainstream society. The confrontation between these two forms of violence in the West Virginia forest is, on one level, simply a horror movie premise. But on another level it is a cultural meditation on the relationship between the violence that society produces and manages and the violence that exists beyond its boundaries entirely. The character of Chavez is particularly interesting from this perspective. He is a man who has built an entire empire of violence and power within the social world, who has used the structures of commerce, intimidation, and organized crime to accumulate authority and control. When he is dropped into Three Fingers Forest, all of that social power becomes completely meaningless. The hierarchies and the systems that gave Chavez his power do not exist in the wilderness, and he is forced to confront a form of power, pure predatory physical dominance in a natural environment, that his entire approach to violence has left him completely unprepared for. The cultural significance of the direct-to-video horror market. The decision to release Wrong Turn 3, Left for Dead directly to video rather than in cinemas is itself culturally significant in ways that are worth understanding. The direct-to-video horror market that flourished in the 2000s was a genuinely important cultural space that served a specific and passionate audience in ways that mainstream theatrical cinema was not equipped to do. Horror fans, particularly fans of the more extreme and uncompromising end of the genre, had always had a complicated relationship with theatrical distribution. The requirements of mainstream cinema distribution, the need to secure wide release across multiplexes, the pressure to obtain ratings that would allow the largest possible audience to see the film, the commercial imperative to appeal to casual moviegoers rather than dedicated genre enthusiasts, all created pressures that tended to soften and sanitize horror films in ways that frustrated the most committed fans of the genre. The direct-to-video market existed outside those pressures. Films released directly to DVD and Blu-ray did not need to worry about theatrical ratings, about appealing to casual audiences, or about the commercial calculations that governed multiplex programming decisions. They could be made for and marketed directly to the specific audience that wanted them, which in the case of the Wrong Turn franchise meant horror fans who appreciated extreme violence, creative kill sequences, and the kind of uncompromising genre filmmaking that mainstream theatrical distribution rarely accommodated. This market was also culturally significant because it democratized horror filmmaking in important ways. By dramatically reducing the financial threshold required for a horror film to reach its audience profitably, the direct-to-video market made it possible for genre films to be produced at budget levels that would have been impossible to justify for theatrical releases. This created space for a vast quantity of horror content that would otherwise never have been made, and while the quality of that content varied enormously, it also meant that horror fans had access to a breadth and variety of genre entertainment that would not otherwise have existed. The Wrong Turn franchise in the context of early 2000s horror. Wrong Turn 3 was released in 2009, which places it within a very specific and historically interesting moment in the development of horror cinema. The early and mid-2000s had been dominated by two major trends in horror: the American remake wave that had brought new versions of classic Asian horror films like The Ring and The Grudge to mainstream American audiences, and the torture porn subgenre exemplified by the Saw and Hostel franchises that had pushed extreme violence and suffering to the center of horror entertainment. By 2009, both of these trends were beginning to exhaust themselves. Audience fatigue with the Asian remake format had set in, and even the Saw franchise, which had been one of the most commercially dominant horror properties of the decade, was beginning to show signs of creative and commercial strain as it entered its later installments. The horror market was in a moment of transition, looking for the next dominant trend to emerge. The survival horror subgenre that the Wrong Turn franchise represented was one of several directions that horror was moving in during this transitional period. Films centered on the premise of ordinary people being hunted through natural wilderness environments by deformed or savage killers had maintained a consistent audience throughout the 2000s, and the Wrong Turn series had been a reliable performer within that space. Wrong Turn 3 arrived at a moment when that particular strand of horror was still commercially viable, but was also beginning to feel familiar to audiences who had seen multiple iterations of the same basic premise. This context helps explain some of the critical reception that Wrong Turn 3 received upon its release. Reviewers who had been enthusiastic about the original Wrong Turn and had found the second film an acceptable continuation of the franchise were less forgiving of the third installment, partly because the specific elements that made the concept feel fresh in 2003 had become much more familiar and genre-conventional by 2009. The cultural moment that had made the original film feel genuinely frightening had shifted, and Wrong Turn 3 was working against that shift with a budget and a creative approach that did not give it the tools to transcend the limitations of its genre position. The legacy of Wrong Turn 3 in horror culture. Despite its mixed critical reception, Wrong Turn 3, Left 4 Dead has maintained a persistent presence within horror fan culture in the years since its release. The film has been discussed, debated, and revisited by horror enthusiasts across various online platforms and fan communities, and it occupies a specific and recognizable place within the Wrong Turn franchise's overall cultural legacy. Within the franchise fanbase, Wrong Turn 3 is generally regarded as one of the weaker installments, but it is also recognized as a film that has its own particular energy, and its own distinctive elements that distinguish it from the other entries in the series. The prison transport premise, the combination of criminal and supernatural threat, and the specific dynamic between Chavez and the other characters give the film an identity that is genuinely its own rather than simply being a mechanical repetition of what came before. The film also contributed to the international dimension of the Wrong Turn franchise's cultural footprint. By being filmed in Bulgaria with an international cast and crew, Wrong Turn 3 helped establish the franchise as a genuinely global horror property rather than simply an American one, and it introduced the series to audiences in Eastern Europe and beyond who might not otherwise have encountered it. This international dimension became increasingly important as the franchise continued to develop, and Wrong Turn 3 played a role in building that international audience base. The broader hillbilly horror tradition that the film belongs to has continued to evolve and develop in the years since 2009, with new films and television series returning again and again to the same cultural anxieties about rural America, wilderness danger, and the threat of the unknown interior that have powered this genre since Deliverance first crystallized them on screen in 1972. Wrong Turn 3 is one chapter in that long and culturally rich story, and its place within that tradition gives it a significance that extends well beyond its individual merits as a piece of filmmaking. If you made it to the very end of this video, then you are exactly the kind of dedicated and curious viewer that this channel exists for. Please hit the like button right now because it costs you nothing and it means everything to the growth of this channel. Share this video with your friends, your family, and anyone who loves horror films or American cultural history. And subscribe to this channel with the bell notification turned on so that you never miss another deep dive like this one. Your support is what keeps this channel alive, and it is genuinely appreciated every single time. See you in the next one.